Amazing. It's all three of us. All right. So Lynn can only join us for a little bit. He's teaching at Lynn, would you like to say where you are?
Yeah, sure. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri right now. Currently key presenting at the ILETA conference, which is the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association. So it's a week-long conference, and it's by pretty much invite only. So I got to do a couple presentations here, several groups of mainly law enforcement trainers, law enforcement industry, and organizations. So despite COVID, like this year wasn't too bad. I think there's a total of about 800 attendees at this current conference.
In person. Wow.
Lynn, we were just about to go into how there were 7. I'm going to pull up the screen here. CNN has been running the story 7 mass shootings in 7 days in the U.S. And Eric was talking about what a lot of these shooters are after, and specifically brought up media. And I do think it's odd that it's taken my old industry this long to make the decision, in not all cases, but only in some, that say we're not going to say the name of the person. It took years. And not every organization's doing that, of course. You know, we're looking at CNN right now, and they're talking about it. And perhaps, you know, I guess it's up for debate. Some people want to know, you know, what is the motive? What but the flip side of that obviously is that, exactly like you said, there's this you know, this effect that people have. They see this, and then there's the, you know, not only gives the idea to do it, but you know, it's sort of an assured way if you're going to do something terrible. You know, your name goes down in history. Yeah. So, you know,
if I could,
yeah, please do.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that. So there's, you know, one of the things that we talk about, especially in the curricula that I teach, you know, for example, we're talking about people problems. People problems require people solutions. Law enforcement specifically is a call for service industry, and so that's who they're dealing with. And I think too many times when we start looking for solutions to problems, whether we're talking about suicide or in this case active killer incidents, you know, we kind of miss the mark. We start treating the symptom versus really identifying the problem and putting in a methodology situation. So when you start talking about specifically like active killer incidents or active shooting incidents, and the FBI released a white paper, probably I think it was, don't quote me on it now, I want to say it was at least 3 years ago, and did a study on all of the active shooter incidents that occurred between 2000 and 2013. And some really interesting findings came out of that, specifically with what they term, in my curriculum, we talk about anomalies or cues of behavior, but specifically with the FBI, they called it concerning behaviors. And what they were seeing was, on average, that the concerning behaviors that was about 4.7. And then in all the cases where it was less than that, the 1 or 2 indicators that were present were enough to warrant an immediate contact. And they also identified some differences between adult killers and juveniles. Usually you would see, like especially with juveniles, you would see some form of leakage, usually via social media, where they're basically relaying their intent. And so one of the psychologically at least, is understanding that when somebody references violence or an act of violence or whatever, that is a subtle form of coercion they're trying to use to let you know. And we say a lot of times in our training, like, people will show you how to treat them. So a very good example of that was Cho, when he did the mass shooting at Virginia Tech. There was a lot of pre-event indicators that were present prior to it, and I won't bore everybody on the channel right now with some of the minutiae specific details, but you saw a lot of those things, and he had actually been to counselors a couple times. I believe it may have been one of the head faculty members, even maybe the dean, and it's like, hey, you the things you're writing about in your class and the things that you're saying are very concerning to us, and you know, we want to understand like what's going on, because it's scaring us. And so he's like, oh, I'm just a poor student or whatever, and he agreed to go to some form of counseling or whatever for that. And all he did was, when he showed up, he signed a list, and then he left and he walked away. And even in his propaganda, essentially his manifesto that he sent to the media that they used when getting his attack, one of the writings he had, it was littered with like, you forced this on me, the blood is on your hands, you throughout the whole thing. And so what that also demonstrates and shows is a failure to cope. So in a lot of these cases, a lot of these things that are taking place, a lot of what's going on in psyche, and certainly the majority of it is a mental health issue, but a lot of it is a failure to identify and treat and deal with individuals who, number one, are suffering from a failure to cope. And then number two, they're showing all the warning indicators, they're showing all the behaviors, and there's, you know, and I can't prove a negative. However, I can say that in a lot of these cases, the situation doesn't. But you know, you hear the saying all the time, and me and my partner make a joke of it. But you know, the whole, if you see something, say something. Well, it doesn't really help much, because first of all, I don't even know what I'm looking at. I don't know what to call it. Second of all, who do I say something to? Who do I report that to? So. Yeah,
can I interrupt you for a second?
These things have been around for a while.
I wanted to interrupt you for a second, because this kind of moves us into another question I had for you, which, since you've been interviewed multiple times for stories related to guns, shootings, and I was curious what you think are the, you know, I mean, we could do positive and negative when it comes to, you know, the average sort of journalist's ability to report those stories. You know, what do you think they get right on a regular basis, and what are they often getting wrong? You know, not to just to make everything negative. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, because I do want to bring up that story that we talk about when you were interviewed once about your program that you teach, and you gave the reporter so much information that when he went to write the story, his brain was about to explode, and he summed it up by saying, see something, say something. And I always use that when I teach that example. I tell people, you can't overload a reporter who's got an hour to put something together with all this information and expect that they're not going to go, you know, revert back to their sort of lowest level of thinking, of training, right? They're gonna match it with something. I've never seen a telephone pole. I see one, I say that's a tree because it's wood and it looks like a tree. I've never seen a telephone pole, right? So, and that's exactly what happened to you. So I'm just curious, you know, because as we're talking about the media and their role and responsibility in all of this, you know, because now, of course, the debate over gun control has come up. You know, what have you found to be sort of the misses, or what are, you know, reporters getting better at when it comes to being interviewed about these stories?
Well, I think the biggest consideration and the biggest thing to be aware of, and I'm sorry, I hope this doesn't feel like The Shining to a bunch of people, me walking through the hotel all loud. But come play with us, Danny. Well, I think the biggest thing is a inability to really take the effective time and energy to actually become educated in some of the minutiae details. Specifically in the industry that I work, like when you look at like the level of scrutiny that's happening, and it's important that it's happening, but the level of scrutiny that's happening specifically with the law enforcement industries, like things like a body camera, like their decisions, their actions are being broken down by the millisecond. So for me, like whenever I've done some of these interviews, I'm very careful and very clear. And yeah, it's a lot of information, but the information is important. And in certain cases, especially when you're talking about things regarding like cognitive issues, advanced critical thinking, decision making, and so on and so forth, and mixing and with the is a very big deal. Words have meaning, and for a law enforcement officer, that can result in them being liable criminally and civilly for the decisions that they make. So yeah, I take it very seriously, and it does get frustrating because like, this need to, well, I have to compress this into, I need several sound bites. I need to compress it into 2 minutes, but something taken totally out of context, can be very dangerous. And that's why you'll see with specifically law enforcement and also military is a complete abhorrence to the news media, because that's all I need is for my message, the thing I'm saying, to get taken totally out of context, phobic, and so on, so on, and so forth. And it's like, no, reality is people are people, and they're the same all over the world. So that's one thing that's kind of frustrating about it. The other thing that gets to be a little bit frustrating about it is I think so much focus is on like the actual incident, what occurred, and I know I've heard you say it a few times, but you hear the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" type thing, and it's like, well, there is a human story to tell, as and this may be hard for some people to stomach, but there's a human side to the individuals that commit these atrocious acts. And realizing that there's several series of decisions and things that occurred that caused this chain of events, this sequence of events to happen, and it's a tragedy. And we look at things like, well, gun violence and having more gun control. I have a very personal opinion about it, and somebody may not agree with me on that. However, a lot of these things, a lot of these rules, a lot of these laws that are already there. It's already a crime to commit murder in any fashion. So regardless of the tool or the implement that you're using for it. And the other thing to understand for people, that's something that really gives me a bit of a giggle when somebody goes and they get their like concealed carry license, for example. They go through the concealed carry course and they think, oh, well, no, you're not. The whole purpose of that course, the whole idea behind that is to make you fully aware of the responsibility you're taking by committing to carrying that firearm in certain public situations. You are responsible for that legally, and therefore the decisions that you make, you have a legal standard to which you have to articulate whatever decisions you make. And the excuse of, say, I didn't know, that dog will not hunt in court. And the other thing to not forget about is the weapon system by itself means nothing. It's still the act of committing homicide or, like killing someone. So the legal standard in which you have to be able to justify what it is that you do is ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Now, with law enforcement,
from a little bit from the media part, though, and everything. And I mean, this is cool, but this is like a seminar at the moment.
Right.
We're going really deep.
Somebody said I can see how he overloaded a reporter.
Yeah. So I mean, let's just back up.
The reason why I bring all that up is I think first, for a reporter to talk about these issues, they need to themselves then become educated to that level where they understand these things, and they understand, like, hey, if I'm going to talk about a weapon system on TV, then I better know at least a little something about it and how it works. Or like in the example where I got interviewed to shoot the quote-unquote bulletproof backpacks, I wanted to be very clear with the reporter that did that story to say, hey, listen, you're the Dutch boy with your finger in the dam about this thing, and we need to talk about the second and third order effects of this. Is what's the psychological impact upon the children and the rest of the families? Like, I would never imagine telling Lily and giving her this backpack and having her, hey, if something happens when you're at school, you need to be in presence of mind that if you're running and hiding, that you need to have this backpack on you. Or if you're in the classroom and somebody starts shooting in the classroom, you have to have the presence of mind to take this backpack and put it in front of you. And so whether it was that or even just the statistic, well, they wanted me to shoot that backpack with specific calibers of specific weapon systems because the intent was to talk about tactical rifles and repeating arms, i.e. like an AR-15 or an M4 or something like that, M16. And the thing is like, yeah, but when you look at the stats and the most common weapons that are used in these different shooting incidents, so on and so forth, it's actually not that weapon system. So, and then too, like, hey, you want me to shoot this backpack, but it's a certified backpack. The ballistics of it are certified to this, this level of protection. So when the individual asked me, like, well, hey, like, how do you think it's going to do? I know exactly how it's going to do because there's a a standard to which that piece of equipment have to apply. So again, I go to the fact that like the story is not the light. There's the one side of it where I want the light motion edges, the sexiness of like, okay, here I got a guy shooting backpacks to see how effective it is. And yeah, it was stopping the rounds, but the problem is like, okay, I put that on a 10-year-old kid, like there's still going to be injuries sustained from that. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. You know, and in some cases, you may almost even be better off to actually take the round versus getting hit with some type of protection, depending on the type of damage that
I'm going to just interrupt you.
Those are things that I would say.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you just real fast for the background on that one, just to give people a heads up, because Lynn was interviewed by somebody who was doing a story about bulletproof backpacks, and what I took away from that story, which is relevant to this conversation about media coverage, is that you said when you agreed to the interview, okay, I will do this because they couldn't find anybody else who was willing to go on camera and shoot a backpack. And so you said they, of course, came to me, you know, because this is another problem. There's very few people in newsrooms who have any connection to a gun owner or are a gun owner themselves, though I did have 2 anchor friends in that newsroom who were gun owners. But they had a connection to rural America. They weren't just like living in downtown Seattle. And not to say that there's always that divide, but I do find that the average sort of city, apartment living Seattleite, for instance, is not the same as like the guy who lives in Hunts out in the middle of nowhere and comes into his and there are those people in newsrooms that you know hunt and fish, and one was a farmer, and so they have a sort of a different perspective, I think. So you were interviewed by somebody else and that didn't have that connection. And obviously, you know, in his personal life, we're privy to the social media post. We know that he's, not necessarily a fan of, I don't want to say he's anti-gun, because I don't want to say that, but I would say that he definitely supports like more regulation. And so you said you do it, but you wanted to be able to talk about human behavior. You didn't want to just shoot a backpack. You wanted to be able to talk about human behavior so that the message could be, hey, if you work in a school, here are things you should be keeping an eye out for, not just handing bulletproof backpacks to kids, because, you know, it's still going to potentially be a serious or if not lethal situation even with that. And so let's give teachers the opportunity to learn more about how to spot a threat. And what happened when they came back to him after the story and they said, so what can we do? Do you remember? Do you want to say? Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, I mean, I can say it. He said, call your legislators and, you know, basically ask for more gun control, and never once brought up your, you know, stuff about the human behavior side of thing, like actual tips. You know, I think he may have referenced it once, but the actual tips for what you were trying to inform the public about. And so, yes, it may be, you know, best of intentions, I guess, but the bias slips in. The short 2-minute story becomes a problem. But as you noticed when they were shooting the story with you, they spent like 15 minutes doing the sequence. And Eric, I don't know if you know, like pulling a book out of a backpack and then reshooting that because they're trying to get all the sequence of what it's like to pull a book out of a backpack. And they spent tons of time on that. They spend the time on the video that they want.
They spent a half an hour on that. And then furthermore, I said, well, hey, how about we cut this sucker open and I'll show you what the actual, what the round actually does to this material so you can actually see what happens. No, that's not that important.
Yeah, so it just goes to show, like, there is...
Before we get deep in this...
Lynn, it looks like you have somebody over your shoulder that's, like, I don't know, it looks like the Grim Reaper is behind you.
Statue.
Oh, okay.
It's a
just
statue.
Wanted to make sure, since we're talking about human behavior, you didn't have somebody coming after you. Go ahead, Eric. Were you saying something?
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, before we get too deep into that, it sounds to me like a lot of the problem, I think many would accuse of it, is people are writing to a conclusion that they already have. And Lynn may be in the way of that or everything else. So if people go in and they already have the story in mind, it's not always helpful to get an expert in because they're looking for either confirmation or they're just going to write and state the
that's the danger of an expert witness, right?
All true. And the other issue, because I do want to bring it back, because I want to get into the coverage, the glory aspects, which I feel like way down the road from, because I think there's something there as well, because we want to spot the behavior about somebody who's about to do it. I think all of us agree. That would be awesome. We also would like to prevent having to spot the behavior of somebody who's wanting to do that. So if there's a way to step back and say, psychologically profiling your effect, and Rich Barris wrote an article about that earlier, which I think is very true, that a lot of these people are seeking glory and they gain glory out of the. Is it possible that, like suicide clusters, by not publishing their name, which is a minor thing, in terms of the whole deal, it does take away a little bit of a possible motivation without kind of harms to others. And I'm going down this path a little bit, not just completely off kilter, but I've had Dr. Robert King out of Ireland, who's done a lot of studies on mass shooters and spree killers, as he puts it. And there's actually two types, which is very fascinating. You have the type that is at the end of their life, and he was putting on the evolutionary scale that, they're not going to have any more kids. They're kind of on the downslope. It's always men just about. And then you have the young ones. And the young ones, especially when you add the glory element to it, this is a biological evolutionary benefit to them. And he brings up James Holmes as an example in hybristophiles. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with hybristophiles, but there are Holmesian girls who go in and visit them with their hair dyed orange and everything, and they get off on being with this killer. So if you erase the motivation of the name, I maybe am extreme, but to do the exact opposite, instead of their name being in the headline, they should be cursed to the worst anonymity possible.
Well, it's very relevant that you brought up Holmes and what happened with that, because that's another very good classic example of how the media got it all wrong. When they showed him in there with his orange hair, and they were trying to make the connection between what he did and why he did it at the Dark Knight Rises and so on and so forth, versus and basically equated him to the Joker, said he was dressed up as a Joker when he went there and he dyed his hair orange. The reality is he actually dyed his hair orange because it was paying homage to Kip Kingle and him basically saying that I'm going to outdo his body count. And so he planned this thing out. And there's from a human behavioral standpoint of it, I could go down some really wicked routes. Save you guys from that, because I do have to get going again. I have another meeting I have to go to. But one of the big things that I think is relevant because his parents were, I believe it was like in San Diego or whatever, they lived in California. When the law enforcement officers showed up to their house to meet with them, to let them know what happened, as soon as they made it to the door, they're like, oh my God, what did he do? They knew immediately, because they knew he was dealing with psychological issues and so on and so forth. And that's the crazy thing about it. Like as far as because you can overlay like the 7-step terrorist planning cycle to some of the things that he did with the planning. Like a lot of these things are actually very apparent, and you can look at it. Like he used improvised explosive devices. He had stuff set up for when they went back to his house to check out what he had in his house. He had booby traps set up. He had IEDs. So I mean, it's just when you look at these different behaviors and these things that take place. And then you add into the fact that you have the media throwing things out there and create this sensationalized thing when they're pulling at straws. They're making what they think are educated guesses to what's really going on, and in reality, they couldn't be further from the truth. And I think, in addition to saying with regard to, there is a certain amount of status there, from the psychological aspect of it. The reason why somebody does some of these things is, again, they feel like this is the only way that they can have their voice heard. And so, again, I think that even if it didn't use, there would still be enough of a situation there where they're like, no, I'm like, I don't think you understand how serious I feel about what it is that I'm saying right now. And something even as simple, we saw with insider threat things in Afghanistan. I went unarmed and embedded in Afghanistan to identify insider threats. And you know what the amazing thing is the psychological indicators. We had like a top 10 list of behaviors. They were almost exactly the same and presented themselves in the same way as how you would see it in killer incidents in the U.S. Again, going back to the fact that people are people, they're the same all over the world. And like one of the big things was, there was a perceived some type of perceived wrongdoing or notion, and that was the number one big reason why an Afghan or a local national would tip over was because they didn't over there they called it like a bedal or a blood feud, but basically it's like, okay, it goes back to the whole status thing, and you start getting into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you see things with like the scarf model and all these other different things, but that's what it is. And so I think they would be better served to, hey, let's start looking into what, on things that were leading up to this, and let's talk about the problem, because I hate to sound like that guy, but some of these things aren't going to go away just because you get rid of a weapon. Anders Breivik used an improvised explosive device in Oslo, Norway, and he used that as the hoax or the ruse or the diversion to pull the attention away from the camp that was on Utoya Island. And then he got on a ferry dressed as a cop and used a bad heuristic. He used urban masking and social camouflage and said, hey, I have an announcement to make. There was something that happened in Oslo, and the counselors brought all the kids in. And then he just started smoke checking people. So, when you have somebody who's determined to do something, they will figure out a way. And you're just, I go back to, like, you're putting a Dutch boy, the finger in the dam. And I think some of the people like you've interviewed, Eric, are like amazing, like, subject matter experts in their field that those are the kinds of conversations should be having with those subject matter experts to talk about, like, what is really going on in these particular situations.
I was just going to bring up, to this point, I couldn't find the original article. I think I must have gotten it because I subscribed to Glenn on Substack. But Glenn Greenwald wrote an article not too long ago about the Pulse shooter and his wife, because I guess she's, I think she may even be on trial or something for it. But this is him talking about the Capitol riot and the officer who died, and wondering, like, when we're going to find out what happened. But this was back in February. But he wrote, lies that serve a political agenda just remain undisturbed because they're useful and people like them. How many still believe Omar Mateen, the monster who murdered 49 people at Pulse, set out to murder LGBTs? He didn't. He had no idea it was a gay club, but it's a useful lie. So I don't know a ton about like, of course, I came from mainstream news, and so the stuff that you're talking about with these case studies, Lynn, way more than I do. But I can say that, like, what he's talking about, where you have the first narrative, the second narrative, the third, and then you just move on to something else, and so the truth may never actually surface, because and in some way that's the sad reality, is that I hate to say this, but I heard about the Atlanta shootings, and I heard about this
leads right to it.
But I didn't hear about the other ones in between. So when I saw there were 7 mass shootings in 7 days, I'm like, what? I didn't even hear about it. And I remember in news years ago, it's like, when there was a mass shooting, we just did it for weeks. And then now it's like, maybe if it depends on how many people die, but maybe you get a day, maybe, because it's just so common now. And I didn't even hear about these other ones in, the other, 2 through 6. I heard about 1 and 7, but, and it's a sad, I mean, I can
actually
understand.
When you look at the rates,
yeah,
when you look at the rates in all actuality of how many times these things have happened, it's actually remained fairly consistent.
Well, I'm just saying the way we've covered. Okay, so I'll give you that, but I'm just saying we've covered them differently.
Increased coverage is what makes that. That's what I'm saying. Increased coverage is what makes that feeling. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm not saying it's okay, but what I am saying is that, like, your perception is your own reality. You only have available information for your brain to derive cognitive reality. So if my reality is like, oh my God, look at, again, and it's given the credence to that. So that would be the only thing I have to add to that. But I'm actually running behind, so I just didn't want to jump off. But I appreciate you having me on, and as always, Eric, it's nice to talk with you.
Hey, Lynn, before you go, hang on a second, because I need to get Eric in on your call before you go, or else I'm going to lose his audio. So hang on a second. All right, bye. Good to see you. Love you. Mean it.
Love you too.
Bye. Okay.
Bye.
Oh, now we have 2 Eric and 1 Allison. Hang on.
Oh God,
okay. There we go. That works. All right, let's just get to a couple super chats real fast. Mike Bruno, good evening. That was almost singing Allison. Tonight I'm drinking 12-year-old Glen Livet. I'm guessing that's a silent tea. Don't be angry, Miss Media. I never said fascism is the worst sin because Mike calls me a fascist all the time. And everybody you have on your channel too, right, Eric? So.
Yes. Yeah, Mike. We have Barnes in the chat. Barnes is a Mike Bruno fascist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you guys should go at it in the chat. Here's another one for Mike. How relevant is Lynn right now? I don't know if that's a joke or not. And let's go back to Courtney because I think I saw something here. I'm no Lynn or Cleopatra, but here's a little beer money. Thanks for sharing your insights, Lynn and gang. So thank you, everybody.
Now, I want to jump on the Atlanta because you led into Atlanta perfectly.
And thank you, Carrie Floyd. Also, go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I'm sorry. The narrative of Atlanta, and by the way, if you get a chance, Nate the lawyer did a great breakdown on a shooting and whether or not it was a hate crime. And that is part of why I think it's a good subject to talk about, because I do think there are increased hate crimes right now against Asians because of it. And, you know, there are some people who take it the wrong way and go after an ethnic group unfairly. And there's an absolute legitimate claim. But then when you try something in to that same narrative, that can actually take away from observation of something real that I feel is happening. And I do feel in the case of Atlanta, it was so quickly put on as this is just a straight hate crime against Asians, when honestly, when I heard when I heard spas and parlors, I thought this is a sex crime. And I know that sounds terrible, but especially when I hear one after another after another. And then Nate did some great research on it, and it shows that no, the person involved who did the shooting actually went to rehab for sex addiction. He lost his girlfriend. He's from an extremist organization. And then they even found an Asian female sex worker who said, I actually kind of believe him that it was not a racial thing. Her claim is a hate crime against sex workers. And that I totally agree with.
But let me ask you this as a counter and a pushback. What about someone who says that Asian women have been fetishized for years, and so that those two are inextricably linked? You can't just say it was about sex if it was targeting Asian women who have had to deal with that for, historically have had to deal with that more than I think, more than I have had to deal with that. And so I'm just curious because I do have friends who I've talked to about this.
Do you ever let your hair go completely blonde?
But we're not fetishized. We're made to. You're right. Women are. Women of different types, right? Of different looks. We do get stereotyped, but the blonde is the stupid person. Okay, we're not usually that. Usually, that's how I was seen. I was a dumbass. But not somebody who was
right. And the Asians are seen as subservient. If we're going to be offensive here in this stereotype.
But I'm just saying. So I don't think it's as. I hear what you're saying, and I understand what Nate said, and I see that side. I've heard a lot of people say that. I do think, however, it's a fair counterpoint for people to say, I don't know if you can just take those two apart, that those two can be linked. Just because somebody has a sexual fetish, generally speaking, and he goes after women in these massage parlors who happen to be Asian, why was he going to those?
And two people who were not, and two who were not as well.
I'm just saying. I don't know if it's as clean cut as one or the other.
Understand.
I could say that. I can see both sides that are trying to make it purely like it has nothing to do with it, and people who are like it's everything to do with it. That there's a fair debate to be had about whether both sides are seeing something that's there, right? And that there's a fair debate to be had from those both sides about who's in fact, and of course nobody really knows unless you're in this guy's head about how that's all working. But I do think it's a fair pushback for people to say, okay, I get it. Yeah, it was a sex thing, but can you necessarily just purely can you take those apart as if they have no connection with each other?
Well, okay. Right now you are diagnosing him and you are literally mind reading, whereas the confession from him wasn't race. It's these places were under investigation for that. There were stings for that. It wasn't, just a case of that. Is we're projecting on him. He himself is saying no. And I do think it's a matter of access. And I don't know about any average city, but it's not necessarily easy to just say, okay, I'm going to go to a particular area and get whatever kind of.
I disagree. I even had a friend I used to work with in Knoxville whose husband was picked up in a sex sting. I probably shouldn't have said what city, but I knew somebody in the news business whose husband, she got divorced after he ended up, and they had different names because she used a TV name. Just for all of you who, keep the TV name just in case your husband's picked up in a sex sting. That way, no one will know. Of course, everyone will know my husband because we all know what his last name is. So, Lynn, you better not get picked up in a sex sting. But as far as everybody else, I think it's actually quite easy to especially nowadays with the internet, it's actually quite easy. So I'm sorry. I think if the guy's going after Asian women specifically, I think it's fair to push back on that. That's all I'm saying. I just think it's fair to push back on what you're saying.
Okay, well, I'm saying he went after the places. So correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not saying that what you and Nate and other people that I've heard make this argument. I'm not trying to say it's not a valid argument to make over this topic. I'm just saying I think the other point I've heard people make is also worthwhile for discussion. I just think it's fair. I don't think it's totally out there.
Chat.
Okay.
Pull up Barnes's chat.
Okay.
Too. I think
hang on.
He's spot on with this.
All right.
Because there is another story that's not being covered at all.
Where is he? Okay.
Relative.
Okay, here we go. Okay, hang on. I'm getting there. Sorry. Okay, Robert Barnes says, interesting the media doesn't want to talk about the sex trafficking connected to the triads that puts these women as vulnerable targets.
Mm-hmm. There is another case here where if they were not, potentially in that situation, some of this is a horrible, I don't know how to say it, horrible circumstance that we have out there. Sex trafficking is a very real problem we have here. And we don't talk about it a lot.
Right.
And I can see some of the
it's a very big problem.
Maybe, right. And maybe it is also easier to just say that he hates Asians and has nothing, because that can be a little bit embarrassing. That can be really hard on a family. And I can understand that. But I'm just saying that immediately going to that, and you had mentioned about not publishing a name and publishing a name. Mm-hmm. Now, in the Asian parlors, when it was definitively a white person doing the shooting, the name was published very quickly and all over the place. The Boulder shooting, there's a different circumstance, and everybody's more circumspect about the name. Why? Is it overnight responsibility? I'm just asking, because it is odd.
Can you repeat your last question, Eric, one more time? Sorry, I was going to pull up another question from the chat. Ask it one more time so I make sure I answer the right question.
In the, I think it's a Boulder case.
This most recent one?
Where...
Okay.
Yes, where it was not the typical, and I will be honest, the majority of the time when you have a mass shooter, it is going to be a white male.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I think, pretty much the majority. Yep. Coincidentally, though, that was not a white male, and the name was not brought up. So the name was brought up immediately in Atlanta, and the targeting and the concept of the targeting was immediately brought up.
Listen, and I don't disagree at all. I agree with you that there are narratives that are pushed and comfortable ideas that are like, okay, we're the media and we're comfortable with this idea, so this will be something we'll put out there right away without exploring it, because no one's going to come after us, or I shouldn't say no one, but the people we care about aren't going to come after us if we get it wrong. Okay, so there are certain things that are like acceptable mistakes that you can make, and I know that people, my peers would disagree with me. Like people are still in there who would be like, that's not it. But I'm sorry, it is a human thing that it's the in-group bias, okay? It's the ideas that you're comfortable with, you're probably willing to just shoot the shit about, and the ideas that are very uncomfortable, you're going to do a ton of research. And so when you're thinking about whatever the narrative is, okay, I had somebody write me today and say, hey, can you do a video about how newsrooms choose to cover vaccines and vaccine safety? Is there a memo that's written that you're not going to do this or you are going to do that? It's kind of the same. It's a very different topic, obviously, but it's a taboo issue. Okay. And so mainstream news is, okay, a person who works anywhere is going to be less likely to speak out about something that's controversial and taboo unless they've done a ton of research and they're like, okay, I'm going to put my butt on the line for this one. Or if it's something that fits a narrative that's very safe, they're going to be more likely to blast it out. And if they're wrong, what are the repercussions? The repercussions are not going to be so great. So I think it's a very basic problem that people tend to look at mainstream news and say there's an intentional propaganda narrative, and I've said before, I do believe at certain levels that happens. However, the majority of the time, I think there are a lot of just scared people who don't have a lot of time to do a lot of research, and sometimes are very arrogant about what they don't know and are just not interested in doing research. And there's safe spaces in media just like everywhere else, right? Safe ideas that you talk about and ones you don't. And so I think to your point, yeah, you're going to blast it out because it fits the narrative. It's a safe narrative. And if you end up being wrong, who cares? Because you're just not, the people that you care about are not going to get that angry. And the people that you don't care about, if they do, who cares? And so with the other stuff, I just think it's like, it's just a safe way of discussing these things. And it's not to excuse it at all. But I think that's what's happening. It's because I really believe in a lot of cases, it's not even a conscious thing that these editorial meetings are. Sure.
Well, we agree on that it's an echo chamber situation.
Yeah. And listen, if only two people are thinking it in the newsroom, but they're too scared to bring it up, it's like if a tree falls and no one's there to hear it, did it really make a sound? It's like, does the idea exist in a newsroom if no one's bringing it up? I don't know. I know the conservatives in my newsroom were a quiet subculture. They didn't talk about being conservative. They were clandestine meetings at the coffee machine and like whispers in the corner and stuff. But it wasn't something
they're like smokers. They need to go outside and hang out with their own kind.
Yeah, so it's the same with any idea. Maybe it's not a conservative idea, but any idea that's taboo, it's something that you're going to wait to release or maybe you won't release at all because you don't want to deal with the consequences of the blowback. But you're definitely going to put more time into researching it than something that's just like no one's going to care if you get it wrong. I really believe that happens quite a bit. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I think that it happens. And to talk about like the sex trafficking issue, there was a woman who reached out to me years ago. I was put on a story before I was covering the environment to just see what people were doing on Thanksgiving, like inviting other people to their homes and just a feel good story for Thanksgiving about people who didn't just stay at home with their families, but went out and either served at a food kitchen or had strangers that may not have a family over or something like that. And a woman who said she had been trafficked and was, had a case, finally, her trafficker had been thrown in jail so she could speak out publicly. She connected with me and I actually became kind of a mentor of hers over the years. And so I talked to her quite a bit about her situation and the stories blew my mind that, that she was walking amongst all of us, without the ability to cry for help, honestly. And then after a while, just the way that she was manipulated in her mind to not want to go because of the fear and this person's taking care of me. And, she had a really crappy home life. So these are the stories that are tough.
Well, it's like cults.
Yeah. And they're tough to tell.
It's
just, I guess it just has to say that like, it's unfortunate that especially television news jumps on these crises when something like that happens, and then all kinds of narratives spin out of control. When you could do well thought through journalism about issues that may be affecting these climax moments, but they don't want to do those. And so it just always becomes these flashbang moments where you miss the opportunity to because then you're like, okay, we're going to keep the story going for a few days until something else crazy happens and we're going to move on. Instead of like, why don't you ever do stuff before the crisis? Like when the crisis isn't happening. And I'm not to say it never happens, but it just doesn't happen enough. It's usually just crisis journalism at this point.
Right. And I agree with that. And that's where I was talking about not publishing any names. And that's not a before trying to pull the reward out of it. I'm not saying to only do that. I'm saying that that's a definitive thing that I think maybe could help lessen some of it. Or, you talked about the clusters and how they are right after each other. A lot of the studies were showing that these events happen, and usually within 13 days or so, the next big event happens, and they call it like the Columbine effect. And there's a ton of copycats. Lynn brought up that Holmes was trying to outdo somebody else. So, I mean, that's all kinds of craziness. And same way the suicide clusters, which have been shown could lead to after somebody, did off themselves in an area.
I was going to bring this up. John Monkey says, Allison, since you were in Knoxville, were you there during the Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom murders? That was a pretty controversial event that involves the debate about, and then I don't know if there was something more after that, but that's all the shows. Oh, here we go. Hate crimes. So I came to Knoxville. So this was a case of two college students, University of Tennessee students, who were raped and murdered, and I believe their bodies were burned, maybe even while they were alive. I don't remember all the. It's a disgusting, horrible case. And I came right after it, but I was there for the trials, and I don't know if what you're talking about was because they were two white kids, that were driving around, and like I remember it was an expensive Toyota 4Runner. And carjacked, and then this whole thing went down. But yes, I was there for the aftermath of that. It was pretty terrible. I will say, this is kind of a little bit off topic, but maybe it's not. One of the things that you have to understand about being a reporter and trying to if you really want to understand where these people are coming from and not just say, I hate mainstream news, is imagine being the person who shows up to interview the parents every day, okay? And then you move on to the next parent and the next parent and the next parent. And after a while, can you see why sometimes journalists are say, you know what, screw this. Like they don't want to deal with the sort of academic debates about gun control or whatever. Can you see, at least, I'm not saying you have to agree, but can you see how somebody who day in and day out is talking to family members who have been, brutally attacked, get to the point where they start to have emotional and sometimes not logical thoughts about these debates. And maybe that means they should be taken off coverage. Maybe they should sit one out or go see a therapist. I'm being serious.
I can see that.
But that happens.
I can see that. And I also want to do a comparison, and maybe it's a different training, but cops deal with it even more.
Sure. Even
and
worse.
So I don't know, what the
and
conclusions are. Right, but that is a relevant thing, or paramedic, or emergency service workers. So I can definitely see that. I've specifically brought up cops because they have to also interview everybody, so they are also interviewing. Obviously, not in the same manner as a reporter, but both are dealing with victims. Both are not always welcome. I don't know if I'd be interested in just taking your theory, though, and exploring it further and see, well, what kind of conclusions do cops come up with, and what kind of conclusions do the reporters come up with, or which way is it? Is there a different each of them, and do they come up with different conclusions or different feelings or thoughts, or not? It would be an interesting thought exercise. Passing a judgment, I'm just saying, I think there's some questions.
Before we go, I wanted to get to two stories that I put in the title of the video so that we don't totally skimp on them, even though I know we're not going to debate these for too long because my babysitter has to go soon, so I got to run. But so this one's amid gun control debate, federal court rules states may restrict open carry of weapons. In case you all didn't hear about this came down today. As the nation debates gun control following two mass shootings in Colorado and Georgia, a California-based federal appeals court decided Wednesday that states may restrict the open carrying of guns without running afoul of the Second Amendment. In a 7-4 decision, an en banc, am I saying that right, panel of the U.S. 9th District or Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a county law in Hawaii that has severely limited permits for open carrying of guns. The decision is likely to help push the Supreme Court to review the issue. The government may regulate and even prohibit in public places, including government buildings, churches, schools, and markets, the open carrying of small arms capable of being concealed, whether they are carried concealed or openly. So we'll see what happens with that. I was going to tell a little quick story of, another problem, obviously, we've talked about before, reporters not having a ton of experience with firearms. When I met Lynn, I had shot a gun one time and I did not own any, and they scared the crap out of me. And, obviously to say he's a firearms expert is an understatement. So I remember we went to church for the first time, and I was like, I put my arm around him or something, and I'm like, what is that? And like, did you bring your gun to church? And he had, and I'm like, what? And at first I was like, this, okay. I was like, I didn't know how I felt about it. But I'll be honest with you, after thinking about it, and this is just like my my just personal opinion, I can understand why people would totally be freaked out. That said, when I thought about it a little bit, I realized, you know what? I'm actually very scared. I hate to say this, but I don't like being in crowded places where my back's to an entrance or exit where people can come in. I don't like movie theaters. I actually, church even freaks me out. I'm constantly looking at people. Is that person? It's just like become part of, of how I think through being in crowded places. I don't like concerts. I don't like that stuff. And so I realized that, like, on one hand, I'm totally freaked out by this.
Especially Dave Matthews.
Exactly. Right. Especially, yeah, the guy writes a song called Crush, and Crash. It just, so many violent words in Dave Matthews songs.
I'm telling you.
But I realized that, if somebody came into the church and tried to take down our service, that person would not get very far because, my husband had a firearm on him, and it would be a short-lived attack. So, it kind of changed my mind on that. I will say, for security reasons, I'm not going to tell everybody how, how I am now handling a gun, because, but I will say that, like, I can understand why people get freaked out. I used to get very freaked out. I still do kind of get freaked out. It's not something I'm around very,
Well, we have a healthy
respect.
I do.
We have a healthy
respect for it. But if you handle it and go to the range, it becomes a healthy respect and less of a fear.
Yeah.
And I do think that everybody should be exposed to them personally.
Well, definitely if you're going to be using them, it's just like you shouldn't put a 4-year-old behind the wheel of a vehicle they could kill someone with. You need to be trained, and that's another thing Lynn does, is like he does a lot of firearms training, or at least he used to before he got into law enforcement, human behavior stuff, and now does it for private clients if they want it. But yeah, he's not the kind of person who thinks just like everybody should have a gun at all. Like that, you should be somebody who's prepared. Right. You're going to use it. Are you ready to use it on someone? Because if you're not, and somebody could take it from you and kill you with it, then you probably shouldn't have a gun. And if you don't know the laws, you also shouldn't have a gun. So you need to be responsible with what the laws are in your area, and you need to know how to use your firearm. And if you don't, those two things, then you shouldn't have one. Okay, last quick story. Naked woman, 43, pulled from Florida storm drain, claimed she was trapped for 3 weeks after she went swimming in a canal and got lost exploring a tunnel, has history of drug use and mental illness. Biggest understatement ever.
That's proof enough.
Yeah. So she told police that she had been trapped in the sewer system since March, when she 3rd, when she went for a swim in a canal. That she was exploring a tunnel and got lost. Only in Florida would you go cave diving in a sewer. That's all I have to say.
Drugs.
Yeah. Anyway, all right.
Well, perfect.
Well, let's just go back to I'm going to go back to the chat real fast and make sure we haven't missed anybody. But we do appreciate you all as usual. Went a little bit longer tonight, probably because I'm hosting and we started late, and Eric's much better at keeping on time. Well,
no, it's fun, and it's nice to have an open-ended discussion without being annoyed. That's what I love. Everybody needs to talk about it. You don't have to agree. Mm-hmm. That's the beautiful part. We can have disagreements and be learning from each other, and gives us all of us something to think about.
Yes, and that's kind of the point of what I feel like YouTube could be if it stopped its speech suppression, which on that note, Ryan Christian is supposed to be on my channel tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, The Last American Vagabond. We were supposed to live stream last night. He got the time wrong and the date wrong. Then, of course, my producer took over the show, so we all know what happened with that. So right now, Ryan and I are scheduled to do the live stream about how he got booted from YouTube. I think this is his second time because it's his backup channel that got booted. And so we're supposed to do 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, Pacific Standard Time. So if you're around, check it out, and hopefully we'll all work. All right.
Oh, I got a plug. 5:30 p.m. tomorrow. I have Dave Rubin on.
Oh my
Mike
God,
Bruno,
that's right. That's huge.
Mike Bruno, you don't want to miss it.
Yeah.
He's probably one of your favorite fascists.
Mike, you should definitely make sure you bring tons of super chat money for fascists on that one, for sure. He will be a great fascist. Let's see. Is there liquor of the week club, Eric?
Whatever's available.
Whatever's available, okay. Mike says truth, but
Seriously,
I don't know
if you guys know a microbrewery, I'm going to keep putting it out there. Somebody's got to know a microbrewery or craft brewery that wants to sponsor the show.
Yeah, let us know. But nothing light. I'm sorry. Beggars can't be choosers.
Yeah, especially if they have IPA. Well, craft breweries don't really have light. That's the cool part.
Okay. All right. Well, bye everybody. It was great to see you. Cheers.
Cheers.